Yep, I'm doing another top 10 video. I love doing these because it lets me review and replay a lot of my favorite games that perhaps I haven't played in a while. I also hope it allows you, the viewer, to either recall playing these yourself or even increase interest in playing a game you've never tried or heard of before. Most of these games I played here as a kid, yep, I'm that old, so I've got a lot of nostalgia goggles on when referring to these. I've also done a top 10 NES Games video before. What will make this video interesting is one primary rule: no first-party Nintendo games. I'm considering anything first-party to be part of Nintendo's flagship series, like Super Mario, Legend of Zelda, Kirby, and the like. On this last one, Kirby games are made by HAL Labs, not Nintendo, but for all intents and purposes, this is a first-party game because of their overall history with Nintendo. This includes being saved from bankruptcy by Nintendo in the early 90s, HAL employee Satoru Iwata later becoming president of Nintendo, and them producing first-party games such as Pinball, Mach Rider, and Balloon Fight. So join me as I celebrate the NES and discuss my top 10 NES games that I think are the best and aren't mainline Nintendo games. I'll start off by giving some honorable mentions. First up is Wizards & Warriors 1. I like Wizards & Warriors 2, as that's just as hard as the first entry and has fantastic music as well. But the second entry has a limit on continues, which is something the first entry doesn't have. I mostly have nostalgia goggles for both games. They can be nearly unfair with its difficulty as enemies come in from nowhere to rush the poor hero, and sometimes it's not clear where the player needs to go to complete a level. Next is Base Wars. And holy crap, I love this game, which is surprising since it's a sports title and it has robots, two things I don't normally like in my video games. But Konami, Ultra Games, does both so well, balancing the overall fun factor that baseball itself has in real life. Side note, I do like sports in real life and I'm a White Sox fan. Take what you will of that knowledge. Base Wars, though, mixes in equipment and power upgrades that can be bought in the shop so that players can actually fight one another in case a base runner meets a defensive man with the ball on base. Instead of automatically being out, the base runner can literally fight for his spot. With a ton of modes and even editable rosters, this is worth a playthrough. Another is Contra. This was a very tough mission because the game is just so good and it's a classic, offering two-player co-op play that makes the game infinitely easier if you have the right partner. And that's saying something because this is one of the many games that defined NES hard. Sometimes this game is too difficult for new players to get into, which is why the Konami code was created to give the players 30 lives. You all know how that goes, right? This was how my brother and I beat this game our first times through. Later as adults, we'd revel on how we could beat this on our own without it. I actually could, though I don't know if he really ever did. One last one is Final Fantasy I, and omitting this one from my top 10 hurts because this is my favorite series of all time. But I can't deny that this is a very flawed game if we look at it now. Hell, it was flawed even back then, with a myriad of bugs such as spells that literally don't work, certain character spots that cannot run even if they selected, and stats such as intelligence that do not function in any way. There is another entry in this series for the NES here that appears on my top 10, and much more deservedly so. The NES is full of fantastic games, even those that I haven't even mentioned yet. Rygar, Life Force, Blaster Master, this system had hit after hit, but we can only have a top 10 list for a reason, though as you'll see, I'll stretch the rules for that a little bit. These games are that good. Number 10. Maniac Mansion, released October 5th, 1987. This game took a number of different conventions and threw them right out the window. One of these is gameplay, as this is a point-and-click adventure. With no mouse and keyboard, the player is relegated to using the control pad to control the arrow icon. This can sometimes be a pain, especially in instances when the player must make their characters escape from pursuers. Another pain point with this is the game's slow frame rate. But if you can get past these, you've got a funny and robust adventure game with multiple endings and a great soundtrack as Dave and company try to rescue his girlfriend. While it has received a sequel in the form of Day of the Tentacle, it's surprising to me that this game has yet to receive an official remake. The original PC version is also available on PC Steam. Number 9, RC Pro-Am 2, released December 11th, 1992. This sequel released 4 years after its original game. Now, I never played the first entry, but I enjoyed the second one quite a bit with my brother and best friend at the time. This is because this game took advantage of the multi-tap, allowing up to 4 people to play at one time. The racing itself controls very smoothly, the computer players are quite fair at first, and combat is fun and innovative. I especially loved the amount of customization that's possible in between races at the shop. Using cash that was found during races as well as won afterwards, players could upgrade their vehicles to go faster, control better, and have better offensive capabilities. If players collected all the letters to spell the game's title, it would upgrade their vehicle to a different and better car. The courses also varied as well, sometimes changing environments themselves too. This game is available on Xbox consoles via the Game Collection Rare Replay. Number 8, Bionic Commando, released June of 1987. This is a console version of an arcade game, which is honestly better than its source material. The biggest idea with this game is that the main character cannot jump. Instead, they have a mechanical arm which can latch onto ledges above and around the player's character. This is tricky to get the hang of at first, but with practice it feels very fluid and good to control. The player defends themselves with weapons, with more obtainable as additional areas are explored on an overhead map. Learning of the plot as it goes on via radio transmissions and obtainable radios, the player is on a mission to rescue Super Joe and stop the Empire, or the Bads, or the NES, depending on what version of the game you're playing, from initiating their Albatross project. What is this project? It's both a super weapon as well as a resurrection of a supremely evil being. If you're playing the American version, this being is called Master D. If you're playing the Japanese version, it's Hitler. In retrospect, it's blatantly obvious why Nintendo of America in the late 80s filtered out all of the Nazi content. My only problem with this? Not being able to knowingly knock out all the Nazis in the American version, and most importantly, being able to kill Hitler.
Dude, you killed Hitler. Awesome.
Regardless, great gameplay with an absolutely fantastic soundtrack make this a must to play. Do note that there's no battery save option or password system, so one straight playthrough, or save states via emulation, is mandatory. There's a remake available on Steam called Bionic Commando Rearmed that's worth picking up, though I'd love for Nintendo to release the original on their NSO service. Number 7, Castlevanias 1, 2, and 3, released between 1986 and 1989. Okay, so I recognize it's a big cop-out ranking 3 games in one spot here. Each of these 3 have a lot of merit on their own, and I didn't want to leave any of them out. Castlevania 1 and 3 provide great gameplay with challenging platforming and enemies, with the latter game offering a number of different paths to take and allies to gain on the way to defeating Dracula. The second entry is more of a Metroidvania, albeit one poorly translated and often confusing. This entry nearly requires new players to have a guide. My brothers and I used our Nintendo Power when we first approached this one. All 3 see the player take control of a member of the Belmont family, Simon in the first 2 entries and his ancestor Trevor in the third. In the first and third, the player must defeat Dracula. In the second, Simon must resurrect Dracula to kill him again, thus ridding himself of a curse that was placed upon him when he was first defeated. All 3 games have fantastic looking environments and sprites, with the third one really excelling here, and all 3 have absolutely fantastic and iconic soundtracks. Seriously, they are so amazing, often repeated in future Castlevania games, and have been remixed endlessly both by Konami and unofficially by fans. All 3 games are on the Castlevania collection, available for all major consoles and PC. Number 6, River City Ransom, released April 25th, 1989. Now call me odd, but I never really got into the Double Dragon series on the NES like my older brothers did. I felt these were fun games, but I just never really got the depth of the beat-em-up genre until later in my life. That would be when I got into River City Ransom. Being a two-player co-op game, I'd often play it with my brother or perhaps another friend of mine. The game sees the players working to rescue one of their girlfriends abducted by an evil syndicate that has taken over their turf. This is actually quite a nuanced game, as there are a number of RPG-like stats that can be increased by using money gained from defeating enemies to consume food and other goods. Additional techniques can be gained to be able to rapid punch and kick, for example. There's also a couple Double Dragon Easter eggs in the game too. Both series are somewhat related as they're all made by Technos Japan. This game is available via the NSO service or through the Double Dragon and Kunio-kun Retro Brawler bundle. I didn't know there were this many games in this series until this bundle came out. If you like River City Ransom, there are a number of sequels on this bundle. Not on this bundle is the remake that was released on the Game Boy Advance in 2004, which plays more heavily into its RPG elements. Number 5. Ninja Gaiden 1 and 2, released between 1988 and 1990. The first entry was released as a console version of a game originally on arcades. I'd argue it's kept the arcade level of difficulty, though that's what morphed into its own category known as being NES Hard. To that end, the first entry is the harder of the two, though the second game isn't easy by any rights. Both games have fast, smooth gameplay via action platforming. They also both have fantastic soundtracks, as well as cinematic storytelling between levels, something of a novelty at the time. The player controls Ryu Hayabusa, who seeks to avenge the death of his father in the first entry, and to stop an evil lord from ruling the planet in the second one. Ryu can attach to walls, being able to climb them in the second entry. He can also use ninjutsu abilities to send out projectiles, such as shuriken, and can even create a pair of after images in the second entry. Why do I not have the third entry on this? I absolutely hate Ryu's shout that he does whenever the player hits the attack button. I also felt the soundtrack wasn't as good and levels not as inventive and diverse as the first two entries. The first entry is playable on the Switch's NSO service, though the second and third are currently missing from it. All three were remade for a 16-bit version on the SNES titled Ninja Gaiden Trilogy. Fans would argue that the soundtrack here isn't as good and the physics feel slightly different, but at least there was password implementation. Number 4. Final Fantasy III, released on the Famicom April 27, 1990. This one is a bit of a cheat because it was released in Japan on the Famicom, not on the US on the NES. They're essentially the same system, and I have played through both an untranslated and fan-translated version of this game via emulation. I've also featured this already on my Top 10 Final Fantasy series video, so please check that out when you have a chance. This is actually a rather large game for an NES RPG, one that took me roughly 25 to 30 hours to beat. Admittedly, there was a fair bit of time there that required level grinding. This entry takes the job system from the first entry, expanded it greatly, and added some special abilities to each job. The soundtrack is absolutely fantastic and varied as well, probably one of the best on the NES. And gameplay is standard turn-based fare. The player takes control of four youths exploring a cave together. They come upon a crystal that grants them its power, telling them to restore balance to the world. Now, the story itself isn't the deepest for a Final Fantasy. This comes later in entries like the 4th and 6th ones, but is still quite suitable for an NES RPG. There's a 3D remake version available on mobile and PC/Steam. This essentially is an updated port from an original DS game. I personally don't care for this version, and instead I recommend playing the Pixel Remaster version on PC Steam. This takes everything that was great with the original Famicom one and makes it better, such as the graphics and music, and trims down a lot of the annoyances, like the need for grinding and the capacity points to switch jobs. With this entry given and down to number 4, this begs the question, where the frick is the Dragon Quest series at? Now, I vaguely remember my brothers playing a small bit of the first entry, Dragon Warrior. I don't remember them sticking with the series after this, which is why I never played any of the Dragon Quest games until 2 years ago, when its first through third entries released on the Nintendo Switch. I started with the third entry and then played all through the series with the exception of the multiplayer ones. I have a previous video comparing the first 3 Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest games with one another. Comparing the Nintendo Switch version versus the Pixel remaster of both series' third entry has me giving the win to Dragon Quest III. I'm sure the HD 2D remake of Dragon Quest III will lock this being the better game. Does that mean my number 4 slot should then go to Dragon Quest or Warrior 3? Let me know in the comments section below. Number 3. DuckTales, released September 14th, 1989. I'm part of the generation that ran home after school to catch the Disney afternoon cartoons where DuckTales and TaleSpin ran supreme. Hoping to cash in on this, Disney had Capcom make games from these series and others like Chip and Dale Rescue Rangers. And thank goodness Disney picked a company like Capcom instead of one like LJN, as the games Capcom released were absolutely amazing, with DuckTales being the front runner as the absolute best. Speaking of Disney afternoon cartoons, all of these games that Capcom made are available on all major consoles except Nintendo Switch, Wii, and PC via the Disney Afternoon Collection. DuckTales sees the player control Scrooge McDuck as he looks for treasure. The player can select 5 different levels to explore, much like how Mega Man games allow the player to tackle the game in any order they want. There are certain limitations, such as being unable to access the African mines until Scrooge can find a certain key in Transylvania. Controlling Scrooge is done so very smoothly, with him being able to bounce off his cane like a pogo stick, taking out enemies and crossing spiky platforms. If you wonder where Cranky Kong got this in Tropical Freeze, here you go. The cane can also be used to strike objects on the ground and or knock them into the air in a 45-degree angle. Many characters from the show, such as Huey, Dewey, and Louie, make appearances throughout the game as well. Once Scrooge reaches the end of the level, he must battle a boss to be able to gain the large treasure of said level. There is no save or password feature here, though the game is relatively short, thus not really necessitating saving. The soundtrack is absolutely amazing here, and while there aren't that many levels, the songs that play for the ones here are fantastic. The Moon Levels theme is probably the one players know best. It contends as one of the best songs on the NES, bar none. I should note that this game was remastered and released in August 2013. This version features voiced dialogue, a remastered soundtrack, and a couple additional stages. I felt this version didn't really get as much traction as I thought it would have, and it is currently available on PC Steam. Between numbers 3 and 2, I would have put Tetris on the NES, but this version was published by Nintendo and therefore is off limits from this list. So why not put Tengen's Atari Tetris? After all, this game is logistically the same and even has 2-player co-op and competitive modes. The biggest reason is that Tengen's version isn't as good as Nintendo's in my opinion. My biggest issue with it is that the best scoring was done by holding down on the D-pad on higher levels, not by actually clearing the most lines or getting Tetrises. Though additional research tells me that this is not the case, there's a whole formula you can see here that actually gets applied for scoring when lines are cleared. Upon further reflection, this makes the game a more nuanced than I originally thought it was. The only thing that's keeping Tengen Tetris back in my mind is nostalgia and preference for Nintendo's version, as I like the latter's music better, as well as the fun cameos by Nintendo characters. But Tengen Tetris is still a great version and I definitely recommend it. Number 2. Crystalis, released July 1990. I featured this game a fair bit on my list of games that need remakes video. In it, I discussed how Suikoden 2 needed a remake. Then a week later, Konami announced said remake. Man, I was hoping SNK would have done the same for this one. The story sees the unnamed hero emerge from a cavern into a strange post-apocalyptic world. After acquiring the Wind Sword from the village of Leaf Elder, the hero must proceed forward in his mission to... well, the game really doesn't say specifically what his mission is. The game itself sees the player move on from one task to the next, opening up the next area in the game. The story does get better as the player progresses. though I feel the translation and dialogue with other characters and NPCs could have been better. Gameplay is that of an action RPG, with attack and defense stats, and an experience and leveling system. This game was compared to Zelda 1 and 2 back in the day, though a more apt comparison now would be to Ys 3 Oath in Felghana, or especially Ys 6 Ark of Napishtim. This is because exploration occurs in an overhead format. When approaching enemies, the player can slash their sword to attack them right on the field, or hold the B button down to charge up a projectile shot. The hero controls fantastic, and the enemy hitboxes are great as well. There is also a magic system, though this is used more in a support capacity in ways such as healing the hero or having telepathic communication to get advice from allies. Finally, the soundtrack to Crystalis is iconic, with melodic and catchy themes that express the many varied environments so very well. You'll be humming along with the overworld theme before you know it. This game is available on the SNK 40th Anniversary Collection on all major consoles and PC, as well as the NSO Collection on Nintendo Switch. Number 1. Mega Man 2 and 3, released between 1988 and 1990. Both of these I've featured heavily on my Top 10 Mega Man series, so I won't retread too much ground here. These two games are the best two non-first-party games released on the NES. They both offer fantastic action platforming in a variety of environments, along with the best soundtracks on the NES. Both games see the player selecting whichever order they'd like to defeat the Robot Masters and the respective stages in, garnering a very large amount of replayability. They also have a password feature allowing players to save their progress, at least up to the beginning of the Dr. Wily Castle stages. They both have fairly basic stories, with Mega Man having to defeat 8 Robot Masters and then the evil Dr. Wily after that. Mega Man 3 innovated a bit further from its previous game with the slide mechanic and additional stages between the Robot Masters and Dr. Wily's castle. One could argue these innovations were not necessary because of how perfect this second entry was. Perhaps it's because there was nowhere else to go that such innovation was deemed necessary. I look at it like it's the Super Smash Bros. Ultimate problem. With all the characters, stages, music, and features that game has, where the heck does the series go from here? Capcom saw that with Mega Man 2, once they started working on the third entry, and they did a pretty damn good job with the third entry, all things considered. You can play both of these on the Mega Man Legacy Collection 1, available on all major consoles and PC. So this was my top 10 NES games list, without the first-party Nintendo series. The original NES had an extremely large library of fantastic games on it, worth exploring for any avid retro gamer or even new players looking to journey into the past. I encourage you to play any or all the games I've got listed here, as they're all fantastic. If you have played these games, which one of them are your favorites? Did these crack your personal top 10s? Let me know in the comments section below. Like, subscribe, and ring that bell for notifications when the next video comes up. Thanks for watching and have a great day.